"I win this match and I'll adopt you," laughed the billionaire. But the poor girl moved a piece on. "Before we continue, please comment on which city you are watching from." The Grand Meridian Hotel's marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers as New York's elite gathered for the annual International Chess Masters tournament. Diamond-encrusted watches caught the light as billionaires mingled with world champions, their conversations a symphony of power and privilege. At the tournament's heart sat Khaled Al Mansour, the evening's crown jewel. The Arab billionaire's presence commanded attention. His custom-tailored Armani suit, his collection of rare Patek Philippe watches displayed on velvet cushions nearby, and his legendary arrogance that had built a tech empire worth $40 billion. Cameras flashed as he deliberated his next move against Grandmaster Viktor Petrov, Russia's chess prodigy. "Khaled's taking his time," whispered a Hollywood actress, her phone recording the match. "Probably calculating another business acquisition," laughed a Wall Street mogul. The crowd's murmurs filled the opulent space, where a single bottle of champagne cost more than most people's monthly salary. Outside, November rain lashed against floor-to-ceiling windows, creating a stark contrast between the warmth within and the cold world beyond. That's when she appeared. A small figure slipped through the hotel's revolving doors, a 5-year-old girl with tangled brown hair, wearing a faded pink dress 2 sizes too large, and sneakers with holes that squelched with each step. Her torn backpack hung from thin shoulders as she stood frozen, overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding her. She hadn't come for the tournament. She'd come seeking shelter from the storm and perhaps a forgotten sandwich from the buffet table. But as her wide eyes scanned the room, they settled on something that would change everything. The chessboard where Khaled Al Mansour sat, completely unaware that his life was about to be transformed by the most unlikely opponent imaginable. The girl's name was Grace, and she was about to teach a billionaire the true meaning of checkmate. Grace had learned to move like a shadow. 3 years in foster care and 2 on the streets had taught her that invisibility was survival. She pressed her small frame against the marble pillars, watching the glittering crowd with the wariness of a hunted animal. The hotel's warmth was intoxicating after hours in the cold rain, but she knew better than to relax. Her stomach cramped with familiar hunger. The last meal, a half-eaten sandwich from a park bench, felt like days ago. The buffet table gleamed across the room like a mirage, laden with delicacies she'd only seen through restaurant windows. But between her and salvation stood a sea of designer gowns and $1,000 suits. Grace had been surviving alone since escaping her latest foster placement 3 weeks ago. The Hendersons had seemed kind at first, but their kindness had conditions. Conditions that made her skin crawl and her heart race with terror. Running away had been her only choice, even if it meant sleeping in subway tunnels and scavenging for food. She crept closer to the chess tournament, drawn by the hushed intensity surrounding the main table. Chess wasn't foreign to her. Her grandfather had taught her before he died, back when she still had a real home. Those memories felt like fragments of someone else's life now, but the 64 squares on the board still spoke to her in ways words couldn't. Khaled Al Mansour dominated the space around the table like a king holding court. Grace had seen men like him before, the kind who believed money could buy everything, including people. His laugh was loud and confident, his gestures sweeping and theatrical. Everything about him screamed entitlement. "The position is quite complex," commented Grandmaster Elena Volkov, studying the board from the sidelines. "Petrov has a slight advantage, but Al Mansour's knight placement is interesting." Grace edged closer, her trained eye immediately grasping the position's intricacies. White's king looked safe behind its pawn shield, but there was something, a weakness that seemed invisible to everyone watching. The crowd saw power and strategy. Grace saw a puzzle with a hidden solution. Khaled leaned back in his chair, spinning his platinum Rolex, one of 12 he'd worn throughout the evening, changing them like accessories. "Time pressure makes champions," he declared to his audience. "In business and in chess, hesitation is death." The irony wasn't lost on Grace. This man who spoke of hesitation had never hesitated to eat, to sleep in a warm bed, or to feel safe. He wore confidence like armor, never knowing what it meant to doubt where his next meal would come from. A security guard's gaze swept the room, and Grace instinctively ducked behind a champagne display. Her heart hammered as polished shoes passed inches from her hiding spot. When the danger passed, she emerged to find herself directly behind Khaled's chair. close enough to smell his expensive cologne and see the precise positioning of every piece on the board. That's when she saw it, the move that would unravel everything. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. Chess isn't about the pieces you see, Gracie. It's about the spaces between them, the moves nobody expects. The solution was elegant, devastating, and completely invisible to everyone in the room. All it would take was one small pawn, moved to one specific square, and the entire position would collapse like a house of cards. Khaled drummed his manicured fingers on the table, his boredom evident. "Perhaps we should make this more interesting," he mused aloud, his voice carrying across the silent room. The crowd pressed closer as Khaled's declaration hung in the air. Grace remained frozen behind his chair, her small hands gripping her torn backpack straps. She could feel the weight of hungry eyes from across the room, not the hunger she knew, but the hunger of spectators craving entertainment. "More interesting how?" asked Viktor Petrov, his Russian accent thick with caution. The Grandmaster had been playing professionally for 20 years, and he recognized the dangerous glint in wealthy men's eyes when they grew bored with merely winning. Khaled's smile was predatory. A side bet, perhaps. Something to make the evening memorable for our distinguished guests. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was exactly the kind of drama they'd come to witness, the collision of ego and money that made for tomorrow's headlines. Phone cameras emerged like hungry vultures, ready to capture whatever spectacle was about to unfold. Grace shifted slightly, trying to remain invisible while staying close enough to study the board. The position was fascinating, a complex middle game where both sides had chances, but only if they could see past the obvious moves. She watched Petrov's fingers hover over his pieces, calculating variations that led nowhere. The Russian Grandmaster was thinking like a Grandmaster, defensively, cautiously, protecting his slight material advantage. But chess wasn't always about material. Sometimes it was about sacrifice, about giving up something precious to gain something invaluable. "I have a better idea," Khaled announced, standing abruptly. His chair scraped against marble, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent ballroom. "Let's give our audience a show they'll never forget." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. Something in his tone reminded her of the foster fathers who spoke sweetly before their voices turned cruel. She'd learned to recognize that particular brand of entitled cruelty, the kind that disguised itself as generosity while planning humiliation. Khaled's gaze swept the room like a spotlight seeking victims. Investment bankers straightened their ties. Socialites adjusted their jewelry. Everyone wanted to be chosen for whatever game the billionaire was about to propose, yet everyone feared it too. His eyes found Grace. She was pressed against the marble pillar, small and still as a hunted rabbit. Her wet hair clung to pale cheeks, and her oversized dress hung like a deflated balloon around her tiny frame. To the crowd, she was an anomaly, a grimy child in their pristine world, as out of place as a sparrow in a jewelry store. "Well, well," Khaled drawled, his voice carrying the dangerous amusement of a cat discovering a mouse. "It seems we have an uninvited guest." All eyes turned to Grace. She felt the weight of their stares like physical blows, some curious, some disgusted, all seeing her as less than human. Her instincts screamed to run, but her legs felt frozen. 3 years of conditioning had taught her that running often made things worse. "Security," someone called, but Khaled raised a hand. "No, no, let her stay." His smile widened, and Grace recognized the expression from her worst nightmares, the smile of someone who enjoyed having power over the powerless. "In fact, I have a proposition for our little visitor." The crowd leaned in, sensing blood in the water. Phones shifted to video mode. This was the moment they'd share on social media, the viral sensation that would make them part of the story. Khaled gestured grandly toward the chessboard, his movements theatrical and deliberate. "You know what chess is, little girl." Grace nodded almost imperceptibly, her throat too tight for words. "Wonderful!" Khaled clapped his hands together, the sound sharp as a gunshot. "Then you'll appreciate this generous offer I'm about to make." He turned to face his audience, ensuring every camera captured his profile. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the most audacious bet of the evening. This homeless child, this complete stranger, will play Viktor Petrov's position." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Petrov's eyebrows shot up in confusion and insult. "And if she wins," Khaled continued, his voice building to a crescendo. "I will adopt her. Give her my name, my fortune, everything." The room exploded in shocked laughter. The proposition was so ridiculous, so impossible, that it bordered on comedy. A 5-year-old street child defeating a Russian grandmaster. It was like watching someone bet on gravity flowing upward. Khaled basked in the reaction, arms spread wide like a conductor before his orchestra. This was his moment. The viral video that would cement his legend as the most daringly generous billionaire of his generation. "Win this match and I'll adopt you," he declared, his voice booming across the marble floors. The laughter reached a fever pitch. But Grace wasn't laughing. She was staring at the chessboard, seeing possibilities that existed in the spaces between moves, hearing her grandfather's voice whispering ancient wisdom about pawns that could become queens. And then, while the billionaire still basked in his audience's amusement, Grace stepped forward and moved a piece. The laughter died as if someone had cut the room's power supply. Grace's small hand had moved the H7 pawn forward 2 squares, a move so simple, so innocuous, that it took several seconds for anyone to understand what had happened. The sound of her piece touching the board echoed in the sudden silence like a gunshot in a cathedral. Petrov blinked, then leaned forward, his trained eyes scanning the position. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, concentration, then dawning horror. The color drained from his cheeks as the implications hit him like a freight train. "Ugh, impossible," whispered Grandmaster Elena Volkov from the sidelines. Her voice was barely audible, but in the tomb-like silence, it carried to every corner of the room. Grace stepped back, her small frame nearly disappearing behind the crowd of adults. She wasn't looking for applause or recognition. She'd learned long ago that attention from adults usually meant pain, but she couldn't help the small surge of satisfaction that warmed her chest. Her grandfather would have been proud. Khaled's confident smirk faltered. "What exactly—" "She's created a forced sequence," Petrov interrupted, his Russian accent thick with disbelief. "The pawn advance opens a diagonal for the bishop, which puts pressure on f7. But that's not the brilliant part." The Grandmaster's hands trembled slightly as he pointed to different squares on the board. "The brilliant part is that she's forced my hand. I have to respond to the immediate threat, which means I have to move my knight, but every legal knight move leads to the same result, which is—" Khaled's voice had lost its theatrical boom, replaced by something much smaller and more uncertain. "Checkmate in 3 moves." Petrov's words fell like stones into still water. "No matter how I respond, she's created an unstoppable sequence." The pawn move was the first domino in a chain reaction that ends with my king's death. The crowd erupted in chaos. Phones that had been recording Khaled's grand gesture now captured something far more extraordinary. A homeless child dismantling a position that had stumped one of the world's best players. But Grace wasn't watching the crowd. She was remembering. "Chess is the democracy of the mind, Gracie," her grandfather had said during their last game together. 3 years ago. He'd been sick then, his hands shaking as he moved the pieces, but his eyes still sharp as winter stars. On those 64 squares, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, young or old. Only your ideas matter. Only truth matters. The memory hurt, but it also strengthened her. Grandpa Joe had been the only adult who'd ever truly seen her, not as a burden or a commodity, but as a human being with value. He'd died when she was 6, and with him had gone her last protector, her last advocate in a world that seemed determined to devour children like her. "This is ridiculous," Khaled sputtered, his composure cracking. "She's just a child. She probably doesn't even understand what she's done." But Grace did understand. She understood more than anyone in that glittering ballroom could imagine. She understood what it meant to be hungry for days at a time. She understood the terror of hiding in abandoned buildings, while police sirens wailed in the distance. She understood the crushing weight of invisibility, of being treated like human garbage by a society that measured worth in bank balances. Most importantly, she understood that chess was one of the few things in the world that couldn't be bought. It was pure, honest, brutal in its democracy. On the chessboard, her empty stomach didn't matter. Her torn clothes were irrelevant. Her lack of pedigree meant nothing. Only the truth of the position mattered, and the truth was that she'd just achieved something remarkable. Dr. Margaret Chen, a child psychologist who'd been attending as a guest of the mayor, pushed through the crowd. Unlike the others, She wasn't focused on the chess position. She was studying Grace. The child's posture told a story of trauma and survival, the way she held herself, always ready to flee, the careful way she avoided eye contact, the defensive crouch that spoke of too many harsh words and raised hands. Extraordinary, Dr. Chen murmured, but she wasn't talking about the chess move. Meanwhile, journalists were already crafting their headlines. Homeless girl humiliates billionaire, 5-year-old chess prodigy stuns elite tournament, rags to riches, the checkmate heard round the world. But those headlines missed the real story. This wasn't about chess genius or rags to riches fantasies. This was about a child who'd been abandoned by every system designed to protect her, yet somehow retained enough hope to trust in the democracy of 64 squares. This was about a moment when pure talent transcended every barrier society had erected between the powerful and the powerless. Petrov made his forced move, his hand heavy with defeat. Then Grace stepped forward again, her movements precise and quiet as snowfall. The second move was just as devastating as the first, a simple bishop development that locked the position into inevitability. Magnificent, breathed Volkov. She's not just playing moves. She's playing concepts. Look how every piece harmonizes with every other piece. This isn't beginner's luck. This is understanding at a level that takes decades to develop. Khalid's face had gone from confident to confused to something approaching panic. The viral moment he'd orchestrated was spiraling beyond his control. This was supposed to be a harmless publicity stunt, a chance to demonstrate his magnanimous nature to his wealthy peers. Instead, he was watching a homeless child systematically demolish everything he thought he knew about power, privilege, and worth. The third move came like an executioner's axe, swift, final, and undeniable. Grace pushed her queen to d8, and suddenly the board told a story that couldn't be argued with, or bought off, or explained away. Checkmate, complete and total victory by a child who owned nothing except the clothes on her back and the knowledge in her head. In the silence that followed, Grace finally looked up at Khalid. Her eyes held no triumph, no mockery, only a quiet intelligence that seemed far older than her 5 years. She wasn't celebrating her victory. She was waiting to see if adults could be trusted to honor their promises. "Well," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I won." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Khalid stared at the board, his mind reeling as he tried to process what had just happened. Around him, the cream of New York society watched with expressions ranging from amazement to schadenfreude. Everyone understood the magnitude of what they'd witnessed, but no one quite knew what came next. "The adoption promise was clearly a joke," came a voice from the crowd. Harold Pemberton, a hedge fund manager known for his ruthless pragmatism, "No one actually expects—" "A promise is a promise," interrupted Dr. Chen, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to advocating for children. She'd pushed closer to Grace, positioning herself between the girl and the crowd like a protective barrier. Especially promises made to children. Khalid's expensive lawyers, who'd been enjoying the evening's entertainment, suddenly looked very uncomfortable. Marcus Goldstein, senior partner at Goldstein, Weiss and Associates, whispered urgently in his client's ear, "Technically, with all these witnesses and video evidence, you've made a public declaration. The legal implications—" "Are you seriously suggesting I adopt some random street child?" Khalid hissed back, his voice low, but not low enough to escape the sensitive microphones of nearby reporters. Grace heard every word. She'd heard variations of them before, in different rooms, from different adults who'd made different promises. The language of rejection was always the same, cold, clinical, designed to reduce her humanity to an inconvenience. But this time felt different. This time she'd won something first. This time she'd proven her worth in the only way society seemed to understand, through performance, through demonstrating value that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. "The child has clearly been coached," suggested another voice from the crowd, Vivian Hartwell, a real estate mogul known for her sharp tongue and sharper business practices. "This is obviously some sort of elaborate con." "By whom?" Dr. Chen's response was immediate and forceful. "Look at her, really look at her. This child is malnourished, probably hasn't had a proper meal in days. Her clothes are soaked and torn. If this is a con, it's the most dedicated method acting I've ever seen." Grace felt the familiar burn of shame as attention focused on her appearance. She was acutely aware of how she looked compared to everyone else in the room, like a sparrow among peacocks, like a dandelion in a rose garden. The contrast was so stark it felt intentional, like she'd been placed there specifically to highlight everything she wasn't. But Chess didn't care about appearances. Chess was honest in ways that people rarely were. The move sequence was genuine, Petrov said quietly. The Russian grandmaster had been studying the position, running through variations in his head, trying to find some escape he'd missed. There is no defense. The child saw something that all of us, failed to see. His admission sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Petrov was ranked 7th in the world, a player who'd defeated world champions. If he confirmed that the moves were brilliant, then they were brilliant. Period. Khaled felt the walls closing in. This was supposed to have been his night, his moment to bask in adoration and demonstrate his superiority. Instead, he was trapped in a situation entirely of his own making, surrounded by cameras that had captured every word of his public promise. Even if the moves were impressive, he said, searching for any escape route. Surely no one expects me to actually. I do. The voice came from an unexpected source, Theodore Blackstone, owner of 3 major newspapers and a man whose opinions shaped public discourse. I expect exactly that. Blackstone stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. At 72, he'd built his media empire on the principle that powerful people should be held accountable for their words. You made a public promise, Khaled, in front of witnesses, cameras, and recording devices. You wagered your word against a child's skill, and you lost. Theodore, surely you understand that this was obviously meant as what, a joke? Blackstone's voice carried decades of authority. You humiliated a child for entertainment, and when she proved herself superior to your expectations, you want to dismiss it as humor. What does that say about your character? The question hit like a physical blow. Character was everything in Khaled's world. Business deals lived or died on reputation, on the belief that a man's word meant something. If he was seen as someone who made promises lightly and broke them casually, the financial implications could be devastating. Grace watched the adults argue about her as if she wasn't there. It was a familiar feeling, being discussed rather than included, being treated as an object rather than a person. But there was something different this time, something that gave her a flicker of hope. Dr. Chen knelt beside her, bringing herself to Grace's eye level. What's your name, sweetheart? Grace, she whispered, the word barely audible. Grace, do you understand what's happening here? Grace nodded slowly. He said if I won, he would adopt me. I won. The simplicity of it was devastating. No complex legal arguments or social maneuvering. Just a child stating the basic truth that adults seemed determined to complicate. And is that what you want? Dr. Chen asked gently. Choice to be adopted by him. Grace considered the question carefully. Want was a luxury she'd learned to suppress. Wanting things only led to disappointment and pain. But as she looked around the ballroom, at the wealth and comfort and security that surrounded her, she couldn't help but imagine what it might feel like to never be hungry again, to sleep in a real bed, to be safe. I want a family, she said finally. I want someone to want me. The words cut through the crowd's chatter like a blade through silk. Suddenly, the legal arguments and social implications seemed petty compared to the basic human need in a 5-year-old's voice. Khaled felt something crack in his chest. Not his heart, exactly, but the armor of indifference he'd built around it. He'd grown up with everything handed to him, had never known what it meant to want for basic necessities. The idea that someone so small could want something so simple and be denied it by adults who had everything stirred emotions he'd thought long buried. But emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not here, not now, not with so much at stake. Look, he said, trying to regain control of the situation. Obviously the child is talented. Perhaps we can arrange for proper chess instruction, maybe a scholarship. That's not what you promised, Blackstone interrupted. And you didn't promise chess lessons. You promised adoption. You promised family. The word family hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning neither man was prepared to fully examine. The standoff stretched into uncomfortable silence. Grace stood perfectly still, her small hands clasped in front of her, watching the adults decide her fate with the patience of someone who'd learned that her own desires were rarely considered in such discussions. She'd been in similar rooms before: courtrooms, social services offices, conference rooms where caseworkers discussed her placement options, as if she were a piece of furniture to be arranged. But this felt different. This time, she'd earned her position at the table. Dr. Chen's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and stepped aside to answer it, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. When she returned, her expression was grim. "I just spoke with my contact at Child Protective Services," she announced to the room. "Grace has been missing from the system for 3 weeks. She was last placed with a family in Queens, but there's no record of how or why she left." The implication hung heavy in the air. Children didn't typically run away from good situations. Khaled seized on this information like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. "See? She's already in the system. This is clearly a matter for the proper authorities, not—" "The proper authorities have failed her." Dr. Chen cut him off. "Look at her. Really look at her. This child has been surviving on her own for 3 weeks. She's malnourished, exhausted, and clearly traumatized. The proper authorities have demonstrably failed to protect her." Grace flinched at the word traumatized. She hated being seen as broken or damaged, hated the way adults used clinical terms to describe her pain, as if naming it somehow made it manageable. She wasn't traumatized. She was surviving. There was a difference. "I'm fine," she said quietly, but her voice was lost in the adults' debate. Marcus Goldstein pulled Khaled aside, their conversation a series of urgent whispers: legal precedent, public relations nightmares, contractual obligations, the language of lawyers trying to find loopholes in what seemed like an airtight situation. Meanwhile, the journalists were having a field day. This wasn't just a human interest story anymore. This was a legal and ethical crisis playing out in real time. The headlines were writing themselves: "Billionaire's adoption promise, legal obligation or cruel joke, child prodigy checkmates system that failed her," when public promises become legal obligations. Sarah Martinez, a reporter from the New York Times, approached Dr. Chen with practiced professionalism. "Dr. Chen, from a child psychology perspective, what are the implications of this situation for Grace?" "The implications are enormous," Dr. Chen replied, her voice carrying professional authority. "This child has demonstrated remarkable intellectual capacity under extreme stress. She's survived on her own for weeks, which shows incredible resilience, but she's also been repeatedly failed by the systems designed to protect her. What happens next will either validate her worth as a human being or confirm her worst fears about adult trustworthiness." Grace listened to herself being analyzed like a case study. It wasn't new. Social workers, psychologists, and caseworkers had been dissecting her psychology for years, but hearing it discussed in front of cameras and microphones made it feel more public, more permanent. She thought about her grandfather's stories of growing up poor during the Depression, how chess had been his escape from a world that seemed determined to crush hope. "The beautiful thing about chess, Gracie," he'd told her, "is that it's completely fair. Every player starts with the same pieces in the same positions. What you do with them depends on your mind, not your circumstances. But life wasn't chess. In life, some people started with more pieces, better positions, stronger support systems. In life, being right wasn't always enough to win." Khaled found himself studying Grace with new attention, stripped of the theatrical context, removed from his initial assumptions. He saw something that unsettled him. This wasn't just a brilliant chess move. This was a human being who'd been systematically undervalued and underestimated by everyone who was supposed to care for her. His own childhood had been one of unlimited resources and constant validation, private tutors, expensive schools, family connections that opened every door. He'd never questioned whether he deserved any of it. It had simply been his birthright. Looking at Grace, he was forced to confront an uncomfortable question. What kind of person might he have become if their circumstances had been reversed? The thought was disturbing enough that he immediately tried to dismiss it. "This is getting out of hand," he announced to the room. "Clearly, this child needs professional care and proper placement. I'll make a donation to the appropriate charity, a generous donation, to ensure she receives the best possible—" "No." Grace's voice was small but clear. "That's not what you promised." The simplicity of her statement cut through every complicated justification and legal maneuver. She wasn't asking for charity or sympathy or professional intervention. She was holding an adult accountable for his word. "You promised to adopt me if I won," she continued, her voice growing steadier. "I won. I proved I was good enough. I proved I had value." The last sentence broke something in the room. Here was a 5-year-old child who'd internalized the belief that she had to prove her worth, that love and family were things to be earned rather than given freely. Theodore Blackstone stepped forward, his media empire's influence weighing behind every word. "Khaled, you have a choice here. You can honor your promise and gain a daughter, or you can break your word and lose your reputation. But you can't do both." "This is extortion," Khaled protested. "This is accountability," Blackstone corrected, "something you've apparently avoided for most of your privileged life." The crowd watched in fascination as one of the world's most powerful men found himself trapped by his own careless words. But Grace wasn't watching the crowd. She was watching Khaled's face, trying to read the emotions that flickered behind his eyes. Fear, anger, calculation, but also something else, something that looked almost like recognition. For just a moment, their eyes met across the chasm of wealth and circumstance that separated them. In that instant, Grace saw not a billionaire or a symbol of everything she'd been denied, but another human being wrestling with a decision that would define who he truly was. The question hanging in the air wasn't really about legal obligations or public promises. It was about what happened when unlimited privilege collided with unlimited need, when someone who'd never wanted for anything met someone who'd wanted for everything. It was about whether wealth could buy wisdom, and whether wisdom could teach wealth what it had never learned about the value of human life. The answer would reshape both of their futures in ways neither could imagine. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Khaled felt the weight of every camera, every expectant face, every whispered conversation that would follow him for the rest of his life. In 42 years of existence, he'd never faced a decision where all paths led to consequences he couldn't control or purchase his way out of. "I need a moment," he said finally, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. "To think. Take all the time you need," Blackstone replied with the patience of someone who knew the outcome was inevitable. "But understand that your silence is also an answer." Grace remained motionless, her small frame a study in controlled tension. She'd learned to read adult moods the way sailors read storm clouds. Survival depended on knowing which way the wind was blowing. Right now, the wind felt dangerous and unpredictable. Dr. Chen approached her again, this time with a gentle smile that didn't quite hide her professional concern. "Grace, honey, can you tell me about your family? Your parents?" The question landed like a physical blow. Grace's carefully constructed composure wavered for just a moment before she rebuilt it. "Brick by brick. My mom left when I was 3. I don't remember her much. My dad, he died in a car accident when I was 4. And your grandfather, Grandpa Joe, took care of me after that. He taught me chess and told me stories and made me feel—" Grace searched for words that could capture what her grandfather had meant to her. "Like I mattered. But he got sick and died when I was 6. The simple recitation of loss was devastating in its matter-of-factness. This child had experienced more tragedy in her brief life than most adults faced in decades, yet she spoke about it with the detached professionalism of someone reading a case file. "What happened after your grandfather died?" Dr. Chen asked gently. "Foster care. 5 different families in 3 years. Grace's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Some were okay, some weren't. The last one, I had to leave." She didn't elaborate, but the adults in the room understood. The statistics on foster care abuse were well known among those who worked with children. The fact that a 9-year-old had chosen the streets over her placement told its own story. Khaled found himself thinking about his own childhood again, specifically the unconditional love of parents who'd celebrated every achievement and cushioned every failure. He'd been wanted, treasured, protected. The idea that a child could grow up believing she had to earn the basic right to be loved was foreign to him as life on another planet. His phone buzzed with messages from business associates who'd seen the live streams. The reactions ranged from amusement to concern to barely concealed schadenfreude. His publicist was having a meltdown. His board of directors was probably in emergency session. The carefully crafted image he'd spent decades building was cracking in real time. But for the first time in his adult life, Khaled found himself caring less about external perceptions than internal truths. Looking at Grace, really looking at her, He saw something that challenged every assumption he'd made about worth and value and what it meant to be human. "You said you've been surviving on your own for 3 weeks," he said suddenly, addressing Grace directly for the first time since his theatrical promise. "How?" Grace looked up at him with surprise. Adults rarely asked her about her survival strategies. They were usually more interested in lecturing her about the dangers of life on the streets. "I'm good at finding places to hide," she said simply. "Subway tunnels are warm. Library bathrooms are safe during the day. People throw away a lot of food that's still good." Each word was a small indictment of a society that allowed children to fall through cracks wide enough to swallow their futures. Khalid had eaten more expensive meals that week than Grace had eaten meals one period. "And you've been alone this entire time?" Grace nodded. "It's safer alone. Other kids, some of them are mean, and adults." She didn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. The crowd was getting restless. What had started as entertainment was becoming uncomfortably real, forcing them to confront realities they preferred to ignore. These were people who donated to children's charities for tax write-offs and social status, who felt virtuous about their philanthropy while maintaining careful distance from actual human suffering. "Perhaps we should involve child protective services," suggested one of the guests, a woman whose own children had never known a day of want or worry. "CPS already failed her," Dr. Chen responded sharply. "They placed her with a family that was supposed to protect her, and instead she ended up fleeing for her safety. The system isn't working for children like Grace." Children like Grace. The phrase echoed in Khalid's mind. What did that mean, exactly? Children who were too smart for their own good. Children who'd been abandoned by everyone who was supposed to love them. Children who'd learned to survive in a world designed to destroy them. He thought about his own children, the ones he'd never had because he'd been too busy building his empire to build a family. He'd told himself there would be time later, that success had to come first. Now, approaching middle age, he was surrounded by wealth and achievements, but had never experienced the simple joy of reading bedtime stories or teaching someone to ride a bicycle. The irony wasn't lost on him that a homeless child had just demonstrated skills that had taken him years to acquire, yet she had no one to celebrate her achievement with. "The legal ramifications of adoption are complex," Marcus Goldstein interjected, clearly trying to give his client an escape route. "There are background checks, home studies, psychological evaluations, all of which can be expedited with sufficient resources," Blackstone countered. "I don't pretend bureaucracy is insurmountable when we both know money talks." Grace listened to the adults debate her future as if she were a business transaction to be negotiated. It was familiar territory. She'd been the subject of similar discussions in courtrooms and conference rooms, where caseworkers and lawyers argued about what was in her best interest, without ever asking her what she wanted. But this time felt different. This time, she'd earned her seat at the table. "What happens if he says no?" she asked Dr. Chen quietly. "Then we find other options," Dr. Chen replied carefully. "There are good families looking to adopt. People who want normal kids," Grace interrupted. "Not kids with problems, not kids who've been in the system." The adult in Dr. Chen wanted to offer reassurance, to promise that everything would work out, but the professional in her knew better. Grace was right. The older children got, the harder placement became. Add trauma history and survival behaviors to the mix, and the prospects became even bleaker. "You're not a problem to be solved," Dr. Chen said instead. "You're a person who deserves love and stability." Grace wanted to believe her, but belief was another luxury she'd learned to do without. Khalid overheard the conversation, and something inside him shifted. This wasn't about charity or public relations or legal obligations anymore. This was about a fundamental question that went to the core of who he was as a human being. When confronted with genuine need, genuine brilliance, genuine humanity, would he step up or step away? The answer would define him more clearly than any business deal or charitable donation ever could. He looked at Grace again, seeing not a public relations nightmare or a legal obligation, but a child whose intelligence and resilience had been forged in the crucible of abandonment and loss. A child who just demonstrated that brilliance couldn't be bought, that wisdom could emerge from the most unlikely places, that worth had nothing to do with bank balances or social status. For the first time in his adult life, Khalid al-Mansour faced a decision that money couldn't influence and power couldn't control. A decision that would reveal who he truly was beneath the carefully constructed facade of wealth and success. The room held its breath, waiting for his answer. Khaled walked to the window overlooking Central Park, his reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. Beyond the hotel's warmth, the city sprawled in all directions, millions of lives unfolding in apartments and shelters, and, yes, in subway tunnels where children learned to survive on scraps and ingenuity. He'd built his fortune on calculated risks, on seeing opportunities where others saw obstacles. But this wasn't a business transaction. This was a human being whose entire future hung on his next words. "Tell me about the chess," he said suddenly, turning back to Grace. "Who taught you to see that combination?" Grace's eyes flickered with something that might have been relief. Finally, an adult was asking about her abilities rather than her problems. "My grandfather. He said chess was like life, but fairer. In chess, everyone starts equal." And what did he mean by that? For the first time that evening, Grace's voice carried warmth. He said in the real world, some people get more pieces to start with. But in chess, everyone gets the same army. What you do with it depends on how well you think, not how much money you have. The philosophy struck Khaled like a revelation. Here was wisdom from a man who'd probably died owning nothing, passed down to a granddaughter who'd inherited even less, yet it contained truths that Khaled's Ivy League education had never taught him. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. He was the best person I ever knew," Grace said simply. "He never lied to me or made promises he couldn't keep." The implicit challenge in her words was clear. Khaled had made a promise in front of cameras and witnesses, then immediately tried to wriggle out of it when the reality proved inconvenient. What did that say about his character compared to a man who'd owned nothing but had given a child the gift of unwavering honesty? Dr. Chen was speaking quietly with several other guests, explaining trauma responses and attachment disorders and the complexities of caring for children who'd been repeatedly abandoned. Khaled caught fragments of the conversation: trust issues, behavioral challenges, the long process of healing psychological wounds. "It's not like taking in a pet," he heard her say. "Children who've experienced trauma don't just need food and shelter. They need patience, consistency, and unconditional love. They need parents who understand that healing takes time." Parents. The word sent an unexpected jolt through Khaled's chest. He'd never seriously considered parenthood. Had always assumed there would be time for family after he'd conquered the business world. But now, faced with the possibility of instant fatherhood, he found himself wondering what kind of father he would be. His own father had been loving but distant, more comfortable showing affection through expensive gifts than emotional availability. Khaled had inherited the empire, but also the emotional patterns. He knew how to provide materially, but had never learned the more subtle arts of nurturing and guidance. Could he learn? More importantly, did Grace deserve to become his experiment in personal growth? "The media attention will be intense," Marcus whispered in his ear. "Every aspect of your life will be scrutinized. Every parenting decision will be public. Are you prepared for that level of invasion?" Khaled hadn't considered the implications. Adopting Grace wouldn't just change his personal life, it would fundamentally alter his public persona. He would no longer be the carefree billionaire bachelor. He would be responsible for protecting and nurturing a child who'd already suffered more than anyone should. But as he looked at Grace, standing small and alone while adults debated her future, he realized that his discomfort with media attention paled in comparison to her need for security and love. "Grace," he said, approaching her with new intentionality, "can I ask you something?" She nodded warily. "If I adopted you, if you became my daughter, what would you want that to mean?" The question caught her off guard. No adult had ever asked her to define what family meant to her. They'd always imposed their own definitions, their own expectations, their own limitations. "I want someone who won't leave," she said finally. "Someone who won't send me away when I'm not perfect. Someone who—" She struggled for words to express a need so fundamental she'd almost stopped believing it could be fulfilled. "Someone who's glad I exist." The simplicity of her request was devastating. She wasn't asking for wealth or luxury or even comfort. She was asking for the basic human need to be wanted, to belong somewhere, to matter to someone. Khaled felt something crack open inside his chest. Not his heart breaking, but his heart opening for the first time in decades. He'd spent so much energy building walls to protect his wealth and status that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be genuinely moved by another person's need. "What if I disappoint you?" he asked. "What if I don't know how to be a good father?" Grace considered his question with the seriousness it deserved. "How do you want to learn?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Want, such a simple word, but it contained everything. Did he want to learn how to love unconditionally? Did he want to prioritize someone else's needs above his own comfort? Did he want to become the kind of person who could provide not just material security, but emotional safety? Looking at Grace, seeing the intelligence and resilience that had emerged from such difficult circumstances, Khaled realized that she had already learned lessons about courage and survival that he'd never needed to master. Perhaps the question wasn't whether he could teach her, but whether he could learn from her. "I've never wanted anything more," he said, and realized as he spoke the words that they were completely true. The room erupted in astonished murmurs. Theodore Blackston smiled with satisfaction. Dr. Chen looked cautiously optimistic. The journalists frantically updated their stories with this unexpected development, but Grace just stood there, studying Khaled's face for signs of the insincerity she'd learned to expect from adult promises. What she saw instead was something she'd almost stopped believing existed: genuine commitment. "You mean it," she whispered. "I mean it," Khaled said, kneeling down to her eye level. "If you'll have me as your father, I would be honored to have you as my daughter." For the first time in 3 years, Grace allowed herself to hope. 3 months later, the transformation was visible in more than just living arrangements. Grace sat in the study of Khaled's Central Park penthouse, her chess set arranged on a mahogany table that cost more than most people earned in a year. But the expensive surroundings hadn't changed the essential nature of their relationship. It was built on the democracy of 64 squares, where worth was measured by the quality of ideas rather than the price of possessions. "Your knight fork is getting stronger," Khaled observed, studying the position where Grace had just won his queen. "But you're telegraphing the setup. See how you moved your knight 2 turns ago? That gave away your intention." Grace nodded, absorbing the feedback with the focused attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. Learning had become safe again, failure had become educational rather than catastrophic, and growth had become possible when it wasn't shadowed by the constant fear of abandonment. The adoption process had been complex but swift, expedited by Khaled's resources and the unique circumstances that had made their story international news. Legal challenges from groups questioning the legitimacy of a spur-of-the-moment promise had been overcome by testimony from witnesses and the clear evidence of Grace's welfare in her new environment. More importantly, the emotional adoption had been taking place gradually, built on small moments of trust and understanding. The first night Grace had slept through without nightmares. The first time she'd asked for help with homework without fear of being seen as a burden. The first time she'd called him Dad instead of Mr. Al-Mansour, tentatively, ready to retreat if the word wasn't welcome. It had been welcome. Dr. Chen visited weekly, not as an investigator but as a support system. The trauma didn't disappear overnight. There were still moments when Grace flinched at sudden movements, still nights when fear overwhelmed her in the darkness between sleeping and waking. But healing was happening, built on the foundation of consistent safety and unwavering acceptance. "Tell me about school," Khaled said, moving his king to safety while they talked. "Mrs. Rodriguez says I'm reading at a high school level," Grace reported matter-of-factly. "And Mr. Chen, he's different from Dr. Chen, says, I understand math concepts that most kids don't learn until middle school." The academic acceleration had been one of their first decisions together. Grace's intelligence needed appropriate challenges, but they'd also been careful not to isolate her further from children her own age. She attended a progressive private school, where individual learning plans were the norm rather than the exception. "Any problems with the other kids?" Grace hesitated. Social integration remained challenging, not because the other children were unkind, but because her life experiences had been so different from theirs. "How do you explain to classmates who complain about having only 2 vacation homes that you once counted yourself lucky to find a warm subway grate? Sometimes they ask about before," she said carefully. "About being homeless. What do you tell them?" "That it taught me things. That I learned to see opportunities other people miss. That being different isn't the same as being wrong." Khaled smiled. Those were lessons he was still learning himself. The business world had always rewarded conformity and conventional thinking. Grace's perspective, shaped by survival rather than privilege, had already begun influencing his own decision-making. Her insights about human nature, about the difference between what people said and what they meant, about the value of authenticity over appearance, had proven remarkably astute. "Speaking of opportunities," he said, "I had an interesting conversation with the International Chess Federation today." Grace looked up from the board with sudden attention. Chess remained her first language, the place where she felt most completely herself. "They want to invite you to a youth tournament in Paris next month. Players from around the world, ages 8 to 18. The opportunity was extraordinary, but Khaled watched Grace's face carefully for her reaction. He'd learned that what seemed like obvious gifts to him might feel like pressure or obligation to someone who'd learned to be suspicious of adult motivations. "Would you want to go?" Grace asked. The question revealed how much healing remained to be done. Grace still couldn't imagine that her wants and preferences might be the primary consideration in decisions about her life. She'd learned to adapt to adult choices rather than express her own desires. "I would love to go," Khaled said, "but only if you want to compete. This is about you, not about me living vicariously through your achievements." Grace considered the offer with characteristic seriousness. International competition meant pressure, expectations, the possibility of very public failure. But it also meant the chance to test herself against the world's best young players, to see how far her abilities could take her. "I want to try," she said finally. "Even if I lose, I want to know how good I really am." The confidence in her voice was new, built on months of discovering that failure wasn't catastrophic when it occurred within the safety of unconditional love. Khaled had worked hard to separate his own ego from her performances, celebrating effort and learning rather than just results. Their relationship had challenges. Khaled's learning curve as a father was steep, complicated by decades of prioritizing work over personal connections. Grace's trust came in layers, each one revealing new depths of both strength and vulnerability. They were both learning to be family to each other, creating something neither had experienced before. But the foundation was solid, built on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than obligation or circumstance. They brought out qualities in each other that had been dormant: Khaled's capacity for nurturing, Grace's ability to trust. Their differences in background and experience became strengths rather than obstacles. "Check," Grace said, sliding her bishop across the board with quiet satisfaction. Khaled studied the position, realizing he'd been so focused on their conversation that he'd missed the tactical sequence developing. Grace had learned to see several moves ahead, not just in chess, but in life, planning for possibilities while remaining flexible enough to adapt when circumstances changed. "Excellent," he conceded, tipping over his king. "You're playing at a completely different level than 3 months ago." "Everything's different than 3 months ago," Grace replied. And for the first time since he'd known her, her smile reached all the way to her eyes. Through the penthouse windows, Central Park stretched green and peaceful in the afternoon sunlight. The same park where Grace had once sought shelter now served as the backyard for her new life, visible from the bedroom where she slept safely every night. The transformation was complete, but the growth was just beginning. 6 months after the adoption, Grace stood before the most intimidating chessboard of her life. The World Youth Chess Championship in Dubai had attracted the planet's most promising young players, but none carried a story quite like hers. The tournament hall buzzed with 15 languages, proud parents, and the quiet intensity that surrounded serious competition. Her opponent across the board was Dmitry Volkov, grandson of Grandmaster Elena Volkov and the tournament's top seed. At 12, he'd been playing competitive chess since he could walk, trained by masters, supported by a federation that treated chess prodigies like future Olympic athletes. Everything about him screamed inevitability, from his perfect posture to his designer chess set, to the way other players stepped aside when he passed. Grace adjusted her position in the chair that still seemed too big for her small frame. 6 months of good nutrition and security had helped her grow, but she remained tiny compared to most of her competitors. What had grown exponentially was her confidence, not arrogance, but the quiet certainty that came from knowing she belonged wherever her mind could take her. "This is the moment we've prepared for," Khaled whispered as he walked her to the board. He'd learned to balance support with independence, to be present without being intrusive. "But remember, the result doesn't change anything," Grace finished. You'll be proud of me no matter what happens. It had taken months for her to believe those words, to internalize the radical concept that love wasn't conditional on performance. But now they gave her the freedom to play without fear, to take risks without catastrophic consequences hanging over every decision. The tournament hall fell silent as the round began. Grace had survived 5 previous rounds, each victory increasing the media attention and pressure. Journalists called her the miracle girl and the Cinderella of chess. But Grace had learned to filter out external noise and focus on the only thing that mattered, the position in front of her. Dmitri played with textbook precision, building his position methodically while avoiding tactical complications. He'd clearly studied her previous games, preparing specifically for her aggressive, intuitive style. His strategy was sound: limit her creative opportunities, force the game into technical channels where his superior training would tell. For 30 moves, his plan worked perfectly. Grace found herself in an ending where Dmitri held every theoretical advantage: better piece coordination, superior pawn structure, deeper technical knowledge. The position was the chess equivalent of David facing Goliath, if Goliath had also been a tactical genius with years of professional training. The media section leaned forward as Grace slipped deeper into trouble. This was the moment many had expected: the talented amateur hitting the wall of serious competition, the fairy tale ending in predictable disappointment. But Grace had learned something in those months with Khalid that no chess book could teach: how to find hope in hopeless situations. She'd survived homelessness, abuse, and abandonment. A difficult chess position, by comparison, was just a puzzle waiting to be solved. She studied the board with the patience her grandfather had taught her and the persistence that life on the streets had demanded. Dmitri's position looked unbreachable, but Grace had learned to look beyond the obvious, to see possibilities that existed in the spaces between conventional moves. Then she saw it. The combination required sacrificing her queen, the most powerful piece on the board, for what appeared to be inadequate compensation. Every logical calculation said the trade was disastrous. Every computer analysis would condemn it as a blunder. But Grace saw deeper, understanding something that pure logic couldn't capture. Sometimes the most powerful move was the one that looked like surrender. She lifted her queen, hesitated for just a moment as doubt whispered in her ear, then placed it on the square where Dmitri's knight could capture it. The hall erupted in confused murmurs. Spectators assumed she'd made a tragic error under pressure. Even Khaled, watching from the audience, felt his stomach drop as he saw his daughter apparently throw away her chances with one catastrophic move. But Dmitri knew better. The 12-year-old prodigy stared at the board with growing horror as the implications of Grace's sacrifice became clear. The queen trade forced a sequence of moves that looked favorable to him, but contained a hidden poison. Grace had given up material to gain tempo, sacrificing immediate advantage for long-term positional dominance. By the time Dmitri realized the trap, it was too late to escape it. Grace's remaining pieces, seemingly weak and disorganized, suddenly coordinated into an unstoppable attack. Her pawns advanced with mechanical precision. Her bishop and knight worked in perfect harmony, and her king became an active participant in the assault. "Magnificent," breathed Grandmaster Elena Volkov from the commentary booth. "She's playing pure chess poetry. This isn't calculation, this is intuition at the highest level." The final position was a work of art. Dmitri's extra queen was powerless to prevent checkmate, trapped on the wrong side of the board, while Grace's humble pawns delivered the killing blow. The tournament's top seed, trained from birth to be a chess champion, had been defeated by a girl who'd learned the game on her grandfather's knee and perfected it in subway tunnels. Grace stood up from the board, her legs shaky with adrenaline and exhaustion. She'd done more than win a chess game. She'd proven that brilliance could emerge from anywhere, that worth couldn't be measured in privilege or pedigree. As the hall exploded in applause, she looked toward the audience and found Khalid's face in the crowd. He was crying, not from disappointment or relief, but from pure pride in what she'd accomplished. Not just the victory, but the grace and courage she'd shown in achieving it. For the first time in her life, Grace had someone in the audience who was unconditionally proud of her, someone whose love didn't depend on her winning or losing, but simply on who she was. The realization hit her like a wave of warmth, and she felt tears of her own starting to fall. She had truly come home. 2 years later, Grace Al-Mansour stood on the stage of the United Nations General Assembly, addressing an audience of world leaders about child welfare and educational opportunity. At 11 years old, she'd become not just a chess champion, but a voice for children who'd been forgotten by systems designed to protect them. "Every child deserves the chance to discover their potential," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast hall. "Not because of their circumstances, but despite them. Not because they've proven their worth, but because worth is inherent in being human." In the audience, Khaled watched his daughter with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose life had been transformed by an unexpected gift. The adoption had changed him as much as it had changed Grace, teaching him about unconditional love, about patience, about the difference between providing for someone and providing meaning for someone. Their relationship hadn't been without challenges. Learning to trust had taken Grace time, and learning to parent had taken Khaled even longer. There had been difficult conversations about her past, setbacks when old traumas resurfaced, moments when both questioned whether they were equipped for this journey. But they'd grown into family gradually, built on shared experiences and mutual respect. Chess remained their common language, but their bond had expanded far beyond the 64 squares where it began. They'd learned to laugh together, argue together, dream together, all the messy, beautiful work of becoming family to each other. Grace's chess career had flourished under Khaled's support, but more importantly, her sense of self had healed and strengthened. She'd won 3 international youth championships and was being compared to the greatest players in history. Yet she wore her achievements lightly, understanding that her value as a person wasn't tied to her performance on the chessboard. The foundation they'd established together focused on educational opportunities for foster children and homeless youth. Grace insisted on being actively involved, not just as a figurehead, but as someone who understood the challenges these children faced. She spoke at conferences, mentored younger children, and worked to ensure that others didn't fall through the cracks that had nearly swallowed her. "The most important game I ever won wasn't at a chess tournament," Grace concluded her UN speech. "It was the game that taught me I was worth loving. That game changed 2 lives, mine and my father's, and showed us both that family isn't about blood or circumstance. It's about choice. It's about choosing to love someone, not because you have to, but because you want to." The applause was thunderous, but Grace's eyes found only one face in the crowd. Khaled was crying again, as he often did when he thought about the chain of events that had brought them together. A careless promise made in arrogance had become the foundation for the most meaningful relationship of his life. After the speech, they walked together through Central Park, the same park where Grace had once sought shelter. Now it was simply their neighborhood, a place for afternoon walks and weekend picnics, and all the ordinary moments that made up an extraordinary life. "Proud of you, kiddo," Khaled said, using the nickname that had evolved naturally between them. Proud of us," Grace corrected, taking his hand with the easy affection that had replaced her initial wariness. They'd both learned that transformation was possible, that a homeless child could become a world champion, that a selfish billionaire could become a loving father, that 2 broken people could create something whole and beautiful together. Their story had started with a chess move, but it had become something much larger, proof that love could bridge any gap, that family could be chosen rather than inherited, and that the most important victories happened not on tournament boards, but in the quiet moments when someone decides to open their heart to another person's need. Grace squeezed Khaled's hand and looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear above the city lights. Somewhere out there, other children were learning that they mattered, that their potential was real, that their circumstances didn't define their futures. The game of transformation never really ended. It just found new players, new possibilities, new chances for love to triumph over indifference. And Grace and Khaled would be there, together, helping others discover that the most powerful move was always the decision to care. Grace's story reminds us that extraordinary potential exists in the most unexpected places, waiting for someone to recognize its value. Every day, brilliant children fall through the cracks of systems designed to protect them, their talents unseen and their worth unrecognized. But transformation is always possible. One caring adult, one act of genuine commitment, one decision to see potential rather than problems can change a life forever. Grace found her champion in Khaled, but thousands of other children are still waiting for theirs. You can be that champion, whether through fostering, adoption, mentoring, or supporting organizations that serve vulnerable children, you have the power to transform lives. The child welfare system needs advocates who understand that every child deserves not just safety and shelter, but the chance to discover and develop their unique gifts. Consider how you might open your heart and home to a child who needs what you have to offer. Research local foster care agencies, volunteer with youth programs, or support organizations working to improve outcomes for children in care. Your act of courage could be the beginning of someone else's transformation story. The next move is yours. What will you choose? Will you let this story inspire you to action, or will you let it remain just entertainment? Somewhere tonight, a child with unlimited potential is wondering if anyone will ever see their worth, ever give them a chance to prove what they're capable of becoming. That child could be waiting for you. Make your move. Change your life, transform the future. Chess taught me that every ending is also a beginning. Your story with a child who needs you could start with a single decision to care. Grace Al-Mansour. Take action today. A child's tomorrow depends on it.